Jenny Morris looked different from the way she had imagined a bride should look on her wedding day. The mirror reflected a pale face, eyes red from crying the night before, and a simple white dress that didn't quite fit right in the shoulders. Her mother stood behind her, adjusting the borrowed veil with hands that trembled almost as much as Jenny's. When she whispered that Jenny didn't have to go through with this, Jenny only touched the stack of medical bills on the dresser, the latest stamped with angry red letters, "Final notice before collections." She had no choice anymore. 6 months earlier, Jenny had been just another struggling 24-year-old, taking whatever work she could find to help support her mother after her father's death. The cleaning service had sent her to the Baker mansion as a last-minute replacement. She remembered being intimidated by the marble floors, the crystal chandeliers, the paintings that probably cost more than she'd earn in her lifetime. Harold Baker had appeared in the doorway of his study while she dusted the library shelves. 70 years old with perfectly coiffed silver hair and eyes that assessed her as if she were another acquisition for his collection. When her mother collapsed 3 weeks later, Jenny had found herself in the hospital corridor, sobbing into her hands as the doctor explained the cost of the emergency surgery. The same corridor where Harold had found her, having overheard that she hadn't shown up for work. His offer to help came with his hand resting on her shoulder in a way that felt both comforting and possessive. The medical bills had disappeared overnight. Jenny's mother recovered, but something in Jenny's expression had changed. The trapped look of someone who now owed a debt she could never repay. The engagement came after a whirlwind courtship that wasn't really a courtship at all. Dinners where Harold spoke about his business empire while Jenny nodded, pretending to understand. Expensive gifts she didn't ask for. And finally, the proposal, presented as a business arrangement when her mother's medical bills had piled up after complications. He presented it as a practical solution for both of them, financial security for her, companionship for him in his later years. Jenny had hesitated only briefly before accepting. What choice did she have? Now, standing in Harold's garden where white roses had been arranged in perfect symmetry, Jenny felt as out of place as a weed among prize blooms. The ceremony was small, her mother, 2 cousins who looked uncomfortable in their Sunday best, and Harold's attorney, who kept checking his watch throughout the ceremony. No friends or family had come to support Harold. He'd outlived most of them, he'd explained when she'd asked. She'd nodded, not questioning why a man of his wealth and status would have no one to witness his wedding day. Jenny's mother sat in the front row, hands clutched so tightly together that her knuckles had turned white. Their eyes met as the officiant asked Jenny to recite her vows. She saw the question there, the silent plea to reconsider, but Jenny forced herself to look away. Her voice was so quiet that the officiant asked her to repeat herself when she said, "I do." Harold's hand felt cold as it closed around hers, his grip too tight as he slid the wedding band onto her finger. When they kissed to seal their vows, his lips pressed against hers with the impersonal efficiency of signing a contract. Afterward, as a few photographs were taken, Harold's attorney approached with a folder of documents, insurance beneficiary updates, property agreements. Jenny watched as Harold signed without reading, then handed her the pen. She hesitated, scanning the dense legal text before signing anyway, each signature feeling like another lock clicking into place around her. At the small reception, little more than cake and champagne on Harold's stone patio, Harold announced they would be leaving for their honeymoon immediately. The car was already packed. Jenny looked up in surprise, but Harold assured her everything she needed had been provided for. They wanted to reach the lake house before dark. Her mother crossed the patio, pulling Jenny into a tight embrace. The whispered reminder to call when they arrived felt like a lifeline Jenny wasn't sure she would be able to grasp. Harold's hand at Jenny's elbow guided her toward the waiting car with practiced efficiency. His touch was neither rough nor gentle, but controlling, as if she were a package to be delivered rather than a bride to be cherished. Jenny looked back as they drove away, watching her childhood home grow smaller until it disappeared around a bend. The modest house where she'd grown up, where her father had taught her to ride a bike in the driveway, where her mother still grew tomatoes in the small garden. It suddenly seemed like a refuge she might never see again. As they left the city behind, buildings giving way to countryside, Harold's posture changed. The polite smile that had been fixed on his face throughout the ceremony faded. He reached over without looking at her and opened her purse, removing her cell phone and slipping it into his jacket pocket. They needed to focus on each other without distractions, he said. Jenny watched the familiar landmarks disappear as they drove deeper into unfamiliar territory. Streetlights became scarce, then non-existent as darkness fell. She stared out the window at her own reflection, a ghost bride overlaid on the passing trees, whispering words so soft that Harold, focused on the winding road ahead, couldn't hear, "What have I done?" The lake house looked different in reality than it had in the photographs Harold had shown her. The elegant vacation home in the glossy prints had transformed into something more fortress-like in the darkness. Jenny stood in the gravel driveway, shivering despite the mild spring night, as Harold unlocked 3 separate deadbolts on the heavy front door. When the lights came on inside, the first thing Jenny noticed was the bars on all the windows, thin but unmistakable black lines creating a grid across each pane of glass. "Bears," Harold explained, following her gaze. "They can be quite determined if they smell food. The bars are for our protection." His tone was matter-of-fact, as if barred windows were a standard feature of any vacation home. Jenny nodded, though she couldn't remember ever hearing about bears breaking through windows in this part of the state. Harold moved through the house with practiced efficiency, turning on lights, checking thermostats, moving with the confidence of someone who had performed these same actions countless times before. He carried the luggage upstairs, his large suitcase and her small overnight bag, and began unpacking methodically. Jenny stood in the doorway of the bedroom, watching as he assigned her a single drawer in the dresser while claiming the remaining 5 for himself. Her few items of clothing looked lost in the empty space. "Where's my phone?" Jenny asked when she realized her purse had been emptied. The pepper spray her mother had slipped her was gone too. "I've packed it safely with the other electronics," Harold replied without looking up from his precise folding. "The reception is terrible here anyway. We can check messages when we drive into town for supplies." Jenny nodded, though she had no way of knowing if they would ever actually go into town, or how far the nearest town might be. Beyond the windows lay only darkness and the silhouettes of tall pines. The first night as Harold Baker's wife unfolded with the same cold precision as everything else he did. Harold approached their marital duties with detached efficiency, as if Jenny were simply another item on his checklist. His hands were clinical rather than passionate, his eyes focused somewhere past her shoulder rather than on her face. When it was over, Jenny excused herself to the bathroom where she cried silently, hands pressed against her mouth to muffle any sound. The tears felt hot against her cold fingers. When she emerged, Harold was already in bed, laying out tomorrow's schedule in the same tone he might use to brief a business associate. Breakfast at 7 sharp. A walk around the property at 9. Lunch at noon precisely. His voice took on a harder edge when he mentioned the first rule of the lake house: no locked doors. Privacy was unnecessary between husband and wife, he explained. The bathroom door had no lock anyway, she would discover. The knob turned freely in both directions, offering the illusion of privacy without its substance. Morning came with pale light filtering through the barred windows. Jenny woke to find Harold already up, dressed in pressed slacks and a button-down shirt as if preparing for a business meeting rather than a day at a lake house. The smell of coffee and bacon drifted up from the kitchen. When Jenny came downstairs, Harold was plating breakfast with mathematical precision. 3 strips of bacon, 1 perfectly round pancake, exactly half a cup of cubed fruit. "I'll handle all the cooking," Harold informed her as he placed the plate before her. "I have specific dietary preferences." He remained standing as she ate, watching each bite with unsettling attention, reminding her to finish everything. The orange juice tasted strangely bitter, but Harold insisted it was freshly squeezed, healthier than the processed kind she was used to. By the time she finished eating, a strange dizziness had settled over her. The room seemed to pulse gently at the edges, objects leaving trailing shadows when she moved her head too quickly. Harold wrote in a small leather notebook while she cleared the dishes, his pen moving quickly across the paper. When Jenny glanced over his shoulder, she caught only a glimpse before he snapped the book shut, a time notation and what looked like dosage amounts. Her hands trembled slightly as she washed the breakfast plates, the water alternately too hot and too cold as her perception wavered. It was during her exploration of the lake house that afternoon, while Harold took a business call in his study, that Jenny found the hair tie. A simple elastic band with a few strands of long blonde hair. Not her brown, not Harold's silver. It had fallen behind the bedside table, visible only when she bent to retrieve a dropped earring. Later, when she asked about previous visits to the lake house, Harold mentioned offhandedly that his previous wife had left him suddenly after a brief marriage. His tone suggested the subject was closed. The pattern became clear by the third day. The strange taste in her food. The dizziness that followed meals. The careful way Harold documented something in his notebook when he thought she wasn't looking. One evening, as she sipped the tea Harold insisted she drink before bed, Jenny recognized the distinctive flavor beneath the honey and lemon, the same bitter undertone as her mother's prescribed sedatives. The realization sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the cool evening air. On the fourth day, when Harold's shower water began running upstairs, Jenny made her move. The landline phone in the kitchen had been her goal since she'd spotted it the first day. With quick, quiet steps she crossed to it, lifted the receiver with trembling fingers, and heard nothing. No dial tone, just dead silence. Tracing the line with her fingers, she found where it disappeared into the wall near the baseboard. When she pulled gently, the cord came freely into her hand, its end cleanly cut. "Who would you call anyway?" Harold's voice directly behind her made Jenny gasp, the phone dropping from her fingers to clatter against the counter. He stood in the kitchen doorway, hair still wet from his shower, expression mild despite the hardness in his eyes. "No one cares about you like I do." Jenny backed away, bumping against the kitchen counter. The casual cruelty in his voice, the practiced nature of his surveillance, the carefully orchestrated isolation, all of it suddenly crystallized into a terrible understanding. The blonde hair tie. The missing previous wife who left suddenly. The bars on the windows that weren't for keeping animals out, but for keeping someone in. She wasn't Harold Baker's first trapped bride, and unless she found a way out, she wouldn't be his last. After discovering the cut phone line, Jenny made a decision to survive. The next morning, she appeared at breakfast with downcast eyes and a soft voice. When Harold criticized her, she apologized quickly. When he gave instructions, she followed without question. Each small surrender seemed to please Harold, whose watchfulness gradually relaxed over the next few days. During one of his business calls, Jenny found her phone in Harold's desk drawer beneath a stack of papers. He hadn't destroyed it as she'd feared, perhaps keeping it as leverage or simply forgetting about it in his certainty that she'd been broken. The battery was nearly dead, but she managed to power it on long enough to photograph the bruises on her wrists where Harold had grabbed her, the cut phone line, and the medicine bottles she'd found hidden in his toiletry bag. The labels matched the prescriptions her mother took for anxiety and sleep, but in much higher doses. On the 7th day of their honeymoon, Harold announced a reward for her improved attitude. They would take the small motorboat out on the lake. Jenny's heart raced with a mixture of terror and hope. The lake represented both danger and the only possible path to freedom, surrounded as they were by miles of dense forest with no marked trails. She replied with practiced enthusiasm, careful to keep her voice steady. As Harold packed a small cooler with drinks and sandwiches, Jenny slipped her charged phone into the pocket of the life jacket hanging by the back door. The same life jacket she made sure to grab as they walked down to the dock, commenting that safety was important even for strong swimmers like herself. The day was beautiful in a way that seemed cruelly indifferent to Jenny's circumstances. Sunlight sparkled on the clear blue water of the lake, surrounded by pine trees swaying gently in the spring breeze. Birds called from the forest, and fish occasionally jumped, creating ripples across the otherwise smooth surface. It might have been a scene from a vacation brochure if not for the knot of dread in Jenny's stomach. Harold seemed more relaxed than she had ever seen him, steering the small motorboat with one hand while the other rested casually on his knee. He had left his notebook behind, along with his usual rigid posture. Out here, with no one to see them for miles, he didn't need to maintain the facade of the doting older husband. Jenny played her role, smiling and commenting on the beauty of the surroundings, while noting with growing unease that Harold had brought only her life jacket. His remained hanging on its hook back at the boathouse. They stopped in the middle of the lake, the shore distant in all directions. Harold cut the motor, letting the boat drift gently on the calm water. The sudden silence felt heavy between them as he opened the cooler to retrieve 2 bottles of water. He commented on the peacefulness of the lake, especially at the bottom. No noise, no demands, no disappointments, just silence. The implication hung in the air as clearly as if he'd spoken it aloud. He held out one of the bottles to Jenny. The seal was broken. She noticed a slight powder residue around the rim and declined, saying she wasn't thirsty yet. Harold's eyes narrowed slightly, but his voice remained casual as he insisted she keep the life jacket on when she mentioned feeling warm. The boat drifted further, the gentle current carrying them toward the deepest part of the lake. Harold's pleasant demeanor vanished when Jenny refused the water a second time, saying she knew what he'd put in it. His face transformed, the mask dropping away to reveal cold rage. His accusations came in a hiss, ungrateful, after everything he'd done for her, the bills he'd paid, the life he'd given her. When Jenny mentioned his previous wife, the one who had left suddenly, Harold's laugh was cold and brittle. His admission came with chilling casualness. She hadn't understood her place either, had thought she could change the rules, make demands. No one had questioned it. Tragic accident. Grieving husband. So easy. Harold lunged across the small boat toward Jenny. His hands reached for her throat, but she twisted away, causing the boat to rock violently. Harold lost his balance, stumbling against the side. Jenny scrambled toward the motor, thinking only of escape. Harold recovered quickly, grabbing her ankle and pulling her back with a growl that she wasn't going anywhere. Jenny kicked out, connecting with his chest. The boat rocked more severely with their struggle. Water sloshed over the sides. Harold grabbed the front of her life jacket, trying to force her toward the side of the boat. Jenny fought with the desperate strength of someone who knew this was her only chance. Her elbow connected with Harold's jaw. He stumbled backward, off balance. The boat tipped precariously. The small boat capsized, sending both of them tumbling into the cold water. The shock of it stole Jenny's breath. The life jacket pulled her quickly to the surface, but as she gasped for air, she felt a hand close around her ankle, pulling her down. Harold's face appeared below her in the clear water, his expression a mask of determined rage even as bubbles escaped from his mouth. The next morning, a local fisherman discovered an overturned boat floating in the middle of the lake. The authorities were called immediately. 3 hours later, Harold Baker emerged from the woods near the shore, clothes soaked and torn, face scratched from branches. He gasped to the first officer on scene that his wife had fallen, that he'd tried to save her, that it had been an accident. His performance of grief was already beginning. The search for Jenny Baker began within the hour, boats combing the lake, divers preparing to search the deeper sections. Harold stood on the shore, a blanket around his shoulders, accepting the sympathetic murmurs of the emergency responders with appropriate solemnity. 3 days later, with no body recovered despite extensive searching, the authorities decided to inform Jenny's mother of the presumed drowning. The woman collapsed upon hearing the news, her anguished cry echoing through the small house where Jenny had grown up, where she had accepted Harold's proposal as a desperate solution to their problems, where she had last hugged her daughter goodbye. Officer Michael Thomas sat across from Harold Baker in the small interview room of the Lakeside Police Station. Thomas had responded to dozens of drowning incidents in his 15 years on the force. The story Harold told matched the usual pattern: a capsized boat, a panicked struggle in cold water, a tragic outcome. Thomas took notes as Harold recounted how Jenny had stood up suddenly, causing the boat to tip. How he had tried to reach her but lost sight of her in the churning water. Harold wore a black suit, immaculately pressed despite his supposed night spent lost in the woods. His grief appeared appropriate, voice catching at the right moments, eyes downcast, hands folded properly on the table. Too proper, Thomas would think later. Too practiced. But in that moment, the officer saw only another grieving husband, devastated by a tragic accident. When Jenny's mother arrived at the station 2 hours later, her grief was raw and messy by comparison. She collapsed into the chair, eyes swollen from crying, hair uncombed, wearing mismatched clothes thrown on in haste. As Thomas explained the search efforts, She shook her head repeatedly, growing more agitated. Jenny was terrified of water, she insisted, her voice hoarse from crying. She nearly drowned as a child. She wouldn't even take baths, only showers. She would never willingly go boating. Never. Thomas noted this contradiction but kept his expression neutral. Grief made people irrational. Perhaps the mother was in denial. Yet when he mentioned the life insurance discussion that would need to happen eventually, he noticed how Harold's attention sharpened, how his questions became more focused, his posture more alert. His concern seemed more directed toward policy details than recovery efforts. The mother's revelation prompted Thomas to dig deeper into Harold Baker's background. The preliminary search revealed the existence of a previous Mrs. Baker, who had also drowned in a boating accident 3 years earlier. The coincidence was too striking to ignore. Thomas requested the old case files while continuing to coordinate the search for Jenny's body. 2 days later, Jenny's mother brought Thomas her daughter's final text message, sent the day before the boating incident, "I don't feel safe here." Just 4 words, but they changed the nature of the investigation. That same afternoon, a call came from the local pharmacy in the town nearest the lake. The pharmacist had recognized Harold's name in the news and reported his unusually large purchases of sedatives and anti-anxiety medications over the past several months, all paid for in cash, all without prescriptions. Meanwhile, Harold had returned to the lake house, ostensibly to gather some personal items. Instead, according to a neighbor who called the police, he was seen burning what appeared to be Jenny's clothing and personal effects in the fire pit behind the house. When questioned, Harold claimed he was merely disposing of items that would be too painful to keep. Thomas noted how quickly the grieving husband was erasing evidence of his wife's existence. The case shifted dramatically on the 5th day when a fisherman found a life jacket washed up in a cove nearly a mile from the accident site. Inside its pocket, sealed in a plastic bag, was Jenny's phone. The device was water-damaged, but the memory card remained intact. Thomas watched in growing horror as the forensic technician recovered dozens of photographs, bruises on Jenny's wrists and arms, medicine bottles arranged on a counter, Harold standing over Jenny's sleeping form. The timestamps showed the photos had been taken in the days leading up to her disappearance. The search of the lake intensified, now focused on recovering evidence rather than providing closure. Divers found Harold's notebook trapped beneath the overturned boat, its waterproof cover preserving the damning contents within. Page after page detailed dosages administered to Jenny, observations of symptoms, adjustments to amounts. The clinical precision of the notes chilled even the most experienced officers. The lake house caretaker, an elderly man who lived in a cottage half a mile away, finally came forward, guilt overcoming his fear. He admitted hearing a woman's screams the night before the boating incident. He had done nothing, having been well paid by Harold over the years to mind his own business. His testimony, combined with the evidence from Jenny's phone and Harold's notebook, was enough for a search warrant. As officers combed through the lake house, Harold was making arrangements to leave town. The insurance company had expedited his claim, citing special circumstances. $600,000 had been deposited into his account that morning. He was packing his car when Jenny's mother appeared in his driveway, demanding to know what he had done with her daughter. The confrontation might have ended badly if not for the security camera Harold himself had installed on his property. It captured his reaction to the grieving mother's accusations, not denying them, but advancing on her with such menace that even on the grainy footage, his intent was clear. Officers watching the live feed from their surveillance position moved in immediately, arresting Harold for assault. It was a temporary charge, but it gave them time to build their murder case. While Harold sat in a cell, refusing to speak without his lawyer present, the search for Jenny's body continued. Her mother kept vigil at the lakeside, a small figure huddled under a blanket, watching as boats crisscrossed the water and divers disappeared beneath the surface. Officer Thomas brought her coffee each morning, sitting silently beside her for a few minutes before returning to his duties. No words could ease her pain, but the companion in her vigil seemed to provide some small comfort. On the 7th day of the search, dark clouds gathered over the lake. The wind picked up, churning the previously calm surface into choppy waves. The search coordinator made the difficult decision to suspend operations until the storm passed. As the boats returned to shore, Jenny's mother remained, her eyes fixed on the darkening water, her hands clasped as if in prayer, still hoping for the closure that continued to elude her. The storm that halted the search for Jenny's body lasted through the night, winds howling across the lake, waves crashing against the shore. By morning, the lake's surface had calmed, but beneath it, everything had changed. The powerful currents had shifted the underwater landscape, dislodging Jenny's body from where it had been wedged beneath a fallen tree in the deepest part of the lake. A search diver found her just after noon on the 8th day, her form ghostly pale against the dark water. The life jacket that should have kept her afloat had been partially torn away, consistent with someone trying to remove it during a struggle. As they brought her to shore, Jenny's mother collapsed at the sight of her daughter's body, her wail cutting through the solemn silence of the recovery team. The autopsy confirmed what the evidence had already suggested. Jenny's body showed signs of prolonged drugging, organ damage consistent with sedative abuse over the week before her death. Bruises on her wrists and throat matched the pattern of the photos she had taken. Water in her lungs confirmed drowning as the cause of death, but defensive wounds on her hands told the story of her final struggle. Most damning was the distinct bruising around her ankle, 5 fingerprints clearly visible, exactly where Harold had grabbed her as they sank beneath the water. Toxicology reports identified the same medications found in Harold's possession in Jenny's system, at levels too high to be voluntary consumption. Forensic analysis of the overturned boat revealed Harold's fingerprints in positions consistent with someone causing the boat to capsize deliberately. The life jacket's partial tearing suggested he had tried to remove it from her during their underwater struggle. Harold Baker's trial began 6 months later. He had hired an expensive legal team who argued vigorously that Jenny's death was a tragic accident. They claimed the medications were for her anxiety, taken willingly. They suggested her fear of water was exaggerated by a grieving mother. They painted Harold as a generous man who had saved Jenny's family from financial ruin, only to lose his beloved wife in a terrible accident. But the evidence told a different story. Jenny's mother testified about Harold's systematic financial control, how he had used their medical debt as leverage to rush Jenny into marriage. The local pharmacist detailed Harold's suspicious pattern of cash purchases for medications typically used to sedate patients. Officer Thomas presented a devastating timeline of Harold's previous marriages, 3 in total, each to a vulnerable younger woman, each ending in sudden death with Harold as the sole beneficiary. The jury deliberated for less than 5 hours before returning with their verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. Harold sat motionless as the verdict was read, his face betraying no emotion. Even at sentencing, when given the opportunity to speak, he expressed no remorse, instead complaining about his treatment and the misunderstanding of his actions. The judge was unmoved. Noting Harold's predatory pattern and the calculated nature of his crimes, she sentenced him to life without the possibility of parole. As officers led him from the courtroom, Harold maintained his rigid posture, his eyes cold and distant. Jenny's mother watched him go, her face tear-streaked but resolute. In the months that followed, the true extent of Harold's crimes came to light. Officer Thomas, unwilling to let the case rest, continued investigating Harold's past. 2 more families found closure as their loved ones' cases were reopened and connected to Harold's pattern of predation. Jenny's mother used the insurance money, finally paid after Harold's conviction, to settle the medical bills that had trapped her daughter in a deadly marriage. The community that had watched the tragedy unfold organized a fundraiser for a memorial bench at the lake's edge, a place for reflection and remembrance. The inscription read simply, "For Jenny, and for all those who were not heard. We are listening now." 1 year after Jenny's body was recovered, her mother returned to the lake. The water was calm, reflecting the blue sky and clouds above. She carried a small bouquet of wildflowers, Jenny's favorites from childhood. As she placed them gently on the water's surface, footsteps approached behind her. Officer Thomas stood respectfully at a distance, hat in his hands. He had come to share news that another of Harold's victims' families had found closure through new evidence. As they stood together by the water's edge, Jenny's mother confessed she kept thinking about all the warning signs she had missed, the subtle changes in her daughter in the weeks leading to her marriage. Thomas nodded in understanding. Predators like Harold, he observed quietly, counted on silence, the silence of their victims, the silence of witnesses, the silence of society unwilling to look too closely at what happened behind closed doors. But Jenny's case had changed that. Her final act of courage, documenting her abuse, had given voice to those who could no longer speak for themselves. The flowers drifted slowly across the lake's surface, carried by the gentle current toward the open water.